Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all here, and I'm glad you could make it to the library. I'm John Haskell, director of the Kluge Center here at the library. In the words of the Kluge Center Charter, it was created to, quote, reinvigorate the interconnection between thought and action through conversations and meetings with members of Congress, their staffs, and the broader policymaking community in order to bridge the divide between knowledge and power. So on a day-to-day basis, what we do at the Kluge Center is to support scholars doing innovative and specialized research and to project scholarly work to a broader audience in events like this. I wanted to draw your attention. We have some material in the front I hope you picked up or will on the way out, upcoming events. This discussion with Ronald White is part of our new Author Salon series. We will have another Author Salon on November 12 with Danielle Allen, political philosopher from Harvard, talking about the Declaration of Independence and equality. It should be a very interesting, it's a lunchtime conversation. Also next week on November 7, Thursday, 4 o'clock, just like this event, 4 p.m. right here in this room, we will have a discussion of the dynamics of the presidential primaries. Amy Walter from the Cook Political Report will be here, and Julia Azari of Marquette University, a contributor to 538 and a former scholar here at the Kluge Center. In addition, on November 21, we have an event in the Coolidge Auditorium downstairs on 100 Years of Women Voting. It will feature literally the person who is writing the book on 100 Years of Women Voting, Christina Wolbrecht from Notre Dame, and also Jane Junn from the University of Southern California. So I hope you can check that out on our website and sign up for Eventbrite tickets. The library is, this fall, starting a new series we want to tell you about and encourage you to attend. These are National Book Festival Presents. So the book festival isn't just on a weekend, Labor Day weekend anymore. We have major events during the course of the year. We had one last week with a mystery writer. Neil Patrick Harris was here for children's books back in September. Coming up next week, we have theologian Karen Armstrong on the lost art of Scripture, rescuing the sacred texts. On November 8, political thriller writer Brad Meltzer on the launch of his new PBS Kids series, Xavier Riddle and the Secret Museum. And on November 13, Andre Aciman on the launch of his new book, Find Me, which is the sequel to Call Me By Your Name. Let me turn to our program today. Ronald White is here. He's one of these people we're honored to have. We're always honored to have our guests, but Ron doesn't need an introduction, but we always try to do things right at the library, so I'm going to do that anyway. He's the author of American Ulysses, A Life of Ulysses S. Grant. It won the William Henry Seward Award for Excellence in Civil War Biography. He also wrote 3 books on Abraham Lincoln, and he's working on another. A. Lincoln, a biography in 2009, was a New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times bestseller. Ron has op-ed essays regularly. They've appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Christian Science Monitor, New York Daily News, and other outlets. He's lectured in the White House, appears on the PBS NewsHour. One thing you may not know about him, he has a PhD in religion and history from Princeton. He's taught at many universities, including UCLA, Princeton Theological Seminary, Whitworth University, Colorado College, Rider University, and San Francisco Theological Seminary. Other than a book on Lincoln's diary, which will be coming out projected next year, Ron is also working on a book on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He will be, after this event, signing copies of the Grant and Lincoln books in the room behind us. Colleen Shogan will conduct the interview today. She's Assistant Deputy Librarian for Collections and Services here at the library. She's the library's designee on the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission and is the Vice Chair of that commission. Please join me in welcoming Ron and Colleen.
Thanks, John. Well, welcome to the Library of Congress, and I can't think of a better way to think about Game 7, a preview of Game 7, than to talk about Lincoln and Grant. So I think it's perfect for this evening. We will take some questions from the audience at the end of the program, so if you have questions for Ron, just save those up and we'll have plenty of time at the end. Ron, to start us off, can you tell us about Lincoln and Grant's early lives? Were there signs of greatness before they became president and general?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for coming. I'm glad the World Series starts at 8:07 and not 4:07. Biographies are popular these days, but I sometimes feel we don't spend enough time on the lives of young people. Think of your own lives when you're 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. So I spent quite a bit of time on Grant and Lincoln. In fact, an early reviewer said, "Are you spending too much time on this? Can't we get on to the adult?" And one of my mantras from this is Grant's words himself. He said, "The reason I do not read biographies is because they do not tell enough about the life of the young person, the formative period of a person's life." He said, "I want to know what a man did as a boy, or we would say what a woman did as a girl." So Lincoln's life is so unusual. Born in 1809 in Kentucky, moving to Indiana in 1816. He had only 1 year of formal education. How could someone with but 1 year of formal education rise to such greatness? So that's a fascinating story. Grant is what I call a late bloomer. My son is a late bloomer, but he's bloomed. And so Grant seems to not be doing anything that's particularly noteworthy. I spent a week at West Point in my research to try to understand what it would mean for a 5'3" boy, 17 years old, to arrive at West Point from the West. Ohio was the West. And so he goes through a lot of different struggles as a young person, but finally, as the Civil War breaks out, his leadership, which I would call latent leadership, emerges. But both of these stories are really fascinating, what I call the formative period of our lives.
Before we continue on to the Civil War, can you tell us about an anecdote that you have in your book on Lincoln, which I think is very instructive? Abraham Lincoln was a very big fan and patron of the Library of Congress. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I like to think that our greatest presidents, and in the latest presidential historian survey, they are Lincoln, Washington, FDR, Theodore Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, were all readers. So Lincoln was a reader, and he checked books out of the Library of Congress. We may get to this, but he checked books out. How would he become a commander-in-chief? This was a kind of a definition very unclear in the Constitution. The only one before him in many ways recently was James Polk in the war with Mexico. He wasn't impressed with Polk. So he checked out books from the Library of Congress. We have those records, and this is how he tutored himself. He was a self-made man. We use that term self-made in the 20th and 21st century for people who made a lot of money. He used it as a term in the 19th century to develop himself as a person. Self-made was to become a whole person. He was really following the instructions of Benjamin Franklin. And one way he did that was by reading and by using, therefore, what was at hand, the Library of Congress.
Lincoln changed his opinion of what it meant to be commander-in-chief after the Battle of Bull Run. Mm-hmm. How and why did he change his mind about that particular role of the presidency?
Well, early on, I think Lincoln thought that he had to give credit and power to those who knew more than he did. So in the warfare, that would have been his generals. But very quickly, he became disillusioned with his generals one by one, until he met Grant. So that's why he had to begin to take command himself. At one point, he almost was ready to take the battlefield. Because remember, the North thought they would win this war rather quickly. They had more than twice as many men in arms, a much greater industrial base. It was shocking that they lost this first battle of either Manassas or Bull Run, depending upon how you want to name that battle. And this forced Lincoln to think, well, what am I to do here as commander-in-chief?
Lincoln and Grant wouldn't actually meet in person until March of 1864. But Lincoln was watching Grant's military career as the Civil War went on. What were some of his early impressions of Grant?
Yes, Lincoln wanted to interview all his generals. He brought them either to the White House or he went out into the field. But he couldn't interview Grant because Grant was out in the West. So I think there are several things that impressed him. First of all, Grant didn't complain. The other generals complained, I don't have enough troops, I don't have this, I don't have that. He never complained. He took what was given. Secondly, he didn't ask. He didn't ask for more than he felt the government could give. And finally, Grant was for Lincoln, who was a Western man, Grant was a Western man. He was not filled with himself. He was not an egotistical person. He simply led the battle. In one famous conversation where someone came to the White House to complain about Grant, say you should remove this man, Lincoln simply sits and listens and says, well, he fights. He fights. And that's what I'm looking for. He fights. And he saw this quality in Grant. In doing this book, at the very end, I became and am a friend of General David Petraeus. And I learned from General Petraeus that he believes without a doubt Grant is the greatest American general. There is no one even in the same game with him. And part of what Petraeus did in preparing to lead the surge in Iraq was to read Grant and to ask his generals to read Grant. And the quality that he found most enduring was his indomitable spirit, what Lincoln called pertinacity. We might call it determination, just this bulldog determination to keep going forward.
In 1862, Grant issued General Order Number 11, and Lincoln was forced to rescind it. So tell us about what General Order Number 11 was and why Lincoln felt he had to revoke it.
General Order Number 11 is his order against the Jews. Grant was very concerned that trading was going on that was benefiting the Confederacy. He was very upset that people in Washington, Salmon Chase, Secretary of Treasury, didn't understand this. And he saw that many of the traders were Jews. They were taking advantage of the opportunity to trade with the Confederates. So he issues this order. When the order gets finally up to Lincoln, Lincoln abrogates it just like that. Julia Grant would say that awful order. But there's a terrific book by our best American Jewish historian called When Grant Expelled the Jews. And what he shows us is that Grant learned from this mistake. I think that's a great quality of leadership. Do you learn from your mistakes? And actually, Grant then will appoint far more Jewish persons in his administration than any previous president. And when a Jewish synagogue was built and the installation was to go forward in Washington, Grant was invited as the guest of honor because the Jews in Washington recognized that he was repentant for what he had done. He had learned his lesson, and now he wanted to reach out to the Jewish community, which he did.
It's one of the military strategies that's often studied is Vicksburg. Why did Lincoln say that Grant's strategy in Vicksburg was the best military strategy in the world?
If you ever have the opportunity to go to Vicksburg, you need to do that. You can read about it, you can see maps. You'll never appreciate it unless you go there. Here's the possibility of a kind of fortress above the Mississippi River where a relatively small garrison dug into caves inside the city of Vicksburg are able to hold off any Union army. William Tecumseh Sherman had tried to take Vicksburg in 1862. He failed miserably. So this was a long, drawn-out battle. And it still, into the end of the 20th century, was an example in the Army War Command manuals of how battle should be fought. I went to the dedication of the statue of Ulysses S. Grant in April of this year at West Point, and I met several military leaders there who said, oh yes, Vicksburg is what it's all about. The strategy, the keenness to understand where were the weak points in the Confederacy, how to keep going forward. What Grant did essentially was he got below Vicksburg, and then instead of going directly to Vicksburg and facing the Confederate Army, he actually went off to the side and defeated the Army's 5 different battles. Instead of going directly, he eluded them and went off to the side and finally came to Vicksburg. He cut himself off from his supply line. He was a farmer, and he believed he could live off the land, and he supplied his troops even though he had no supply line. And I think all of these together why Lincoln thought it was such a great victory. And military historians today would acclaim that this is one of the great victories in modern warfare.
Lincoln and Grant agreed on the strategy to hopefully end the Civil War, which was to take the fight directly to the Confederate Army on at least 5 separate fronts. Why did they agree on this strategy? Why did they think this was a winning strategy? And how was it different than previous strategies that had been employed by earlier generals?
Well, the earlier generals had the idea that the way you would defeat the Confederacy was to occupy their main cities. So if you could occupy Nashville, or you could occupy Atlanta, or you could occupy Memphis. But Lincoln understood, and Grant understood also, that you will never be able to defeat an enemy in that large a geographical territory. So the strategy was you do not go after the city, you go after the army. And if you defeat the army, then you will ultimately end the war. And the way wars were fought in those days was you would fight a battle. Gettysburg was 3 days, and then you would step back. You would retreat, not retreat, but you'd kind of refit, you'd deal with the wounded, and then you'd go forward again. Lincoln and Grant agreed that the way to do this battle was to not ever stop. That if you had a larger army, what Lee did very shrewdly was he would look where the North was coming, the Union Army, and then he would move his men to block that. Then there'd be a little lull, and the Union Army would come again. Well, he'd move his men to mount that. But if you had the larger army and you kept going forward, there was no possible way that over length of time Lee could possibly stop you. And that's how Grant won with Lincoln's agreement. Here's a funny story, though. As Lincoln did trust Grant, Grant came to share with him the battle plan for the spring of 1864, and Lincoln said, "Oh, don't tell me. I can't keep secrets. I can't keep secrets. I trust your battle plan, but don't tell me what it is because I can't keep secrets." I just think that's amazing.
Well, that leads into the next question, because that is the crux of the matter. Lincoln trusted Grant.
Yes, yes.
So talk to us about why he trusted Grant so much and why this made such a difference in the persecution of the war at the end.
Mm-hmm. Several months ago, I wish I could come up with his name on the PBS NewsHour. There was a wonderful interview of the man, Osama bin Laden is back in the news, of the man, the Navy commander who led, he wasn't there in person, but he was in charge of that whole raid to get Osama bin Laden, and now he retired. And I was so struck by the interview in which he said, he said, you can have the right policy, but if you don't have the right character, it will never succeed. And your troops will understand very quickly your character. And they will not follow you unless they trust your character. So this is what I think Lincoln discerned in Grant. Not simply that he had the right strategy or that he had the right policy or that he could coordinate 5 armies at once, which he did, but there was the character of the man is what I think drew Lincoln to Grant and why they formed what I would call a kind of mutual admiration society. They trusted each other. And with all the criticism that came forward, after Cold Harbor, all these incredible casualties that went forward, Lincoln was hearing all this criticism of Grant. And the word was Grant a butcher, all this sort of stuff. Yet Lincoln trusted Grant, and they had this simpatico relationship.
You wrote a shorter book on Lincoln's second inaugural, focused on that speech. Why do you think it's Lincoln's greatest speech?
Well, Lincoln thought it was his greatest speech. He said it is my best effort. But he also said, but it's not immediately popular. And why is it not immediately popular? Because as the war was coming to a close, the audience wanted him to do and say 2 things. First of all, they wanted him to be a little crowing a bit. In those days, the parade was before, not after the speech. And there was a float in the parade from a Washington newspaper which literally said, it's time for Lincoln to crow a bit after all the criticism, what he's done. But Lincoln didn't crow. He used 2 personal pronouns in the entire address. I say Lincoln disappeared. He used 0 personal pronouns in the Gettysburg Address. Can you imagine a modern politician speaking like that? But secondly, he used what I call inclusive language. He kept using the words all and both to sort of say we're all involved in this. We all bear the blame. Do not point your finger at the South. Well, I read the letters and diaries of people who were there that day, and they were angry. You and I think people would be excited about inauguration. Why were they angry? Because if you think about it, every person there had probably lost a father, husband, son, brother, and they were angry at the South. And they wanted Lincoln to give voice to their anger, but he did not do that. He understood that if the South was meant to bear the blame and the shame alone, they would never be able to re-enter the Union. And sadly, after Lincoln's death, his own Republican Party gave to the South the blame and the shame. And this just set up a terrible situation that went on for decades. Someone told me this morning, the war is still going on in terms of people believing this in the South, the blame and the shame.
One of the great what-ifs of American history has to do with Lincoln and Grant and the night that Lincoln was assassinated. Now, Grant was supposed to attend the theater with Abraham Lincoln and his wife, along with Julia Grant, but ended up, they did not join Abraham Lincoln at the theater that evening. Do you think if Grant had been there, would it have made a difference? And did Grant think if he had been there, it would have made a difference?
It's quite a fascinating question. Why did not Grant come? His wife did not want to come. She felt someone was stalking her all day long. She was frightened. They wanted to see their children who lived in a suburb of Philadelphia, and so they decided not to attend. I don't think Grant could have stopped the assassination. I mean, this man came in John Wilkes Booth from the back. When Grant got to Philadelphia about midnight, someone met him with a telegram and told him what had happened. And he did say, "What if I would have been there? I will think about this for the rest of my life. What if I had been there?" So yes, he never compared himself to Lincoln. In his memoirs, he said Lincoln deserves to be the great person of our time. Grant never compared himself to Lincoln. But I think he ran for president because he watched the terrible presidency of Andrew Johnson and said, all right, I guess I'm the person that needs to pick up the vision of Lincoln that has been dropped at the end of the Civil War. Yeah.
In your book on Lincoln, you have a great line. You describe Lincoln as a gentle leader free of ego. So tell us about that, and why do you describe him in that way, and how did he earn that reputation?
Well, none of us are free of ego. Politicians are not free of ego. Lincoln was not really free of ego. Did I really write that line?
I think you did. I think you did. He said that he was thought of as being, maybe not he was, but he was thought of.
And part of what I was saying in terms of the Gettysburg Address or the second inaugural address, Lincoln always pointed beyond himself. Even as he was traveling on his 13-day train trip from Springfield to Washington for his inauguration, he would say to crowds, it's amazing, he said, I know you're not really cheering for me. You're cheering for the office. And if Stephen Douglas was here, you'd cheer for him. And if so-and-so is here, you'd cheer for him. And why don't all of you who are against me ride with me on the train to the next train stop? He had this sense that he was a temporary holder of this position and that he had been given this office. We're struggling now, aren't we, with a respect for the office of the presidency. He held this respect for the office. And therefore, he had a respect for those who disagreed with him. He never doubted their patriotism. He would challenge their ideas or their policies, but he always respected those on the other side. And this is what I think made him, in one sense, a gentle leader who, at the end, he had this vigorous debate with Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas ran against him for president of the United States. I think history's often symbols. So Lincoln gets up there to give his inaugural address. He's got this tall hat on, and he's wearing a cane. And Stephen Douglas steps forward without saying a word and takes the cane out of Lincoln's hand so he isn't going to feel awkward with it, and holds it during the inaugural address. This is Stephen Douglas. The respect that he had for Lincoln was just amazing.
Okay. What do you think that Lincoln and Grant at times were loyal to a fault? And if they were, how did that affect their leadership?
I think, especially for Grant, maybe for Lincoln also, loyalty was his DNA. I mean, this was a virtue, a masculine virtue that was cultivated in the 19th century. You were to be dutiful. You were to be faithful, even if it went against your own instincts or your own good sense. So its strange part of writing about Grant is that he seemed to be a terrific judge of people in the Civil War. He knew that Rosecrans, who was going to be the guy most likely to succeed from West Point, was up to no good. He could make decisions about other generals who weren't able to follow through. But when he gets to the White House, somehow he loses this quality. He's loyal to a fault. He's loyal to people who had served with him in the Civil War, who, what do we say, Washington corrupts, who were being corrupted by the power that they achieved here in this place. He maybe didn't manage carefully enough. He appointed people in his cabinet who he didn't really know, like he knew the generals from West Point in the war with Mexico. And so he wasn't attuned to what they were actually doing behind his back. What's interesting, though, is that I think people accrue over a length of time kind of a power from the people of goodwill. So even though people were upset with the scandals in Grant's second administration, they never blamed him, and Grant could easily have been elected to a third term when he finished his second term. Julia wanted him to run for a third term because he had accrued such goodwill from the American people.
About 6 months ago, you wrote a Washington Post op-ed about a new statue. You referenced it that was erected at West Point to honor Ulysses S. Grant. Tell us about why you wrote the op-ed, and also comment, if you can, about current controversies concerning Civil War statues, particularly regarding Confederate statues.
Well, this is isn't it? It's a very, very contentious issue. And I certainly understand the decision for some to want to take the statues down or to move some of these statues or monuments into the library or wherever. However, I was struck by a phrase a couple of weeks ago I read by Gordon S. Wood, who's our finest American revolutionary historian, professor emeritus at Brown. And Wood talked about what he called the historical condescension that is just overwhelming us today. That we have such moral superiority, that we are willing to look back on those poor people in the 19th century who didn't understand what they should have understood. So I'm kind of one that wants to be wary of this kind of historical condescension, of judging people 100 years ago or 200 years ago by our standards. Instead of taking the time, it takes time to try to understand their mindset. So for example, when Andrew Johnson wants to prosecute Robert E. Lee for treason, Grant stands up for Lee and says, "You will not prosecute him for treason. Do you not understand he's the spiritual leader of the South? I do not agree with the cause for which he fought, but I do agree with the leadership of this man. We will not prosecute him for treason." Now that's not quite the same thing as the monument, and I understand the monuments were built, many of them, many, many years later in moments of white supremacy. But I was thrilled, therefore, when West Point, after all these years, this is part of the Grant resurgence, decided to build a statue to Grant. There was no statue to Grant at West Point. All the other great West Pointers, there was a statue. So I thought this was a great moment, that we not only should take statues down, but we ought to build statues up. And we ought to be thinking about if there are women, if there are African Americans, if there are those who have been slighted in our story of American history, we ought to think about building statues and not simply tearing other statues down. Yeah.
Would have Grant liked the statue?
I think he would, yeah. The sculptor did a good job. I love the man who came up with the money for it, a wonderful person. It's been a great time of conversation with why and how you would do this. Grant was a great horse person, and so they had a ride by. The two riders were women who rode the horses by as the statue was done. Hey, 21st century.
Last question before we go to the audience for their questions. Why do you think readers of your books or Americans as citizens, why do you think they should reconsider Grant and Lincoln's leadership today? What is relevant? What can we learn from them that would be applicable to today's challenges?
Well, I think we write and read biographies for maybe two reasons. One is that they do provide examples. And secondly, I think they're a mirror by which we look at ourselves. Now, These are historical figures. Lincoln's not going to help us with climate change. General Grant can't tell us what to do in Syria. But I do think there are values here that are enduring. After we say they're historical persons, I think there are values, and I think Lincoln especially, the spirit, the values that he communicates in his life and his value will go on 100 years from now. Just to conclude with this, I spoke 10 years ago in Hamburg, Germany, at the invitation of the State Department. They sent me to Germany at the beginning of the Obama administration. People stayed away from our embassies all through the Bush administration because of their opposition to our war in Iraq. They stayed away in Europe. So they said, we want you to start soft diplomacy. I said, what's that? He said, that's Abraham Lincoln. So I'm talking to a group of 12th and 13th grade teachers in Hamburg, Germany. And I said, can I ask you a question? I said, well, why are you interested in Lincoln? And they said, well, we know George Washington, we know Thomas Jefferson, but those are aristocratic people, very much like the people in our history. When we think of America, we think of Lincoln. You can start at the bottom with very little pedigree. This is not Winston Churchill. You can have little formal education and you can rise. I think the challenge for our day is, can we still rise? Can we hold out the hope for young people that you can rise? And that's why Lincoln is renowned around the world. 2 weeks ago today, I gave a lecture in Oxford on Abraham Lincoln. And I was amazed at the turnout and the interest and the questions. Amazing how Abraham Lincoln travels.
Okay, great. Questions from the audience right over here.
Hey, Ron. Okay, as we go through a sentence in the first inaugural, we must be friends. We are not enemies. Mm-hmm. And we jump to the second inaugural, with malice towards none, with charity for all. What would Lincoln say to the Republican Party today?
Oh. Next question. As an historian, I struggle with trying to answer contemporary questions. I'm very willing to talk with you in person. I know in this room we have a range of opinions. And so I would go back, I guess, to the idea that these are moral examples, and I trust that the moral examples can inform what we want to do today, the kind of leaders that we want to do today, and who we want for the future. That's my answer to that question.
Right here.
You mentioned Lincoln had 1 year of education. Could
Yes.
you describe when, where, and what
Yes.
form, and compare that with Grant's
Yes.
pre-West Point education?
Yes, thank you. Yes, the best we can determine is that boys in that era would be working with their fathers on a farm, except maybe in January and February when it was too cold. And so there'd be itinerant teachers that would come through, and the various families would come together and hire this teacher to teach their boys for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. So we think that Lincoln did this 5 times, maybe 6 times. Grant had a much better education. He went to school not only in Georgetown, Ohio, where he grew up. He went to a private academy in Maysfield, Kentucky for 1 year. He went to an academy run by John Rankin, who was a leader of the Underground Railroad for 1 year in Ripley, Ohio. He has a good education. His father sent him to West Point because it was free, and West Point was one of only 3 engineering schools. This says so much about the 19th century. Can you imagine this today? Grant says to his father, "Father, I do not want to do this, but if you think I should, I will." Mm-hmm. When's the last time you heard someone say that? So he went not wanting to go. But once he got there, he got into this thing, and he wasn't sure he wanted to be a military officer. Thought he wanted to be a teacher of mathematics. But we're on a journey, and the journey took him to places he never imagined.
When we talk about character, I had always heard that politics in the 1860s was not exactly clean, that bribery was involved, and I mean, totally ignoring the guys, bashing the guys on the head. There was a lot of subterfuge going on. Could you describe that, and when did that stop, or, well, ignoring the last 5 years?
Never stopped.
When did that actually end in the political system here?
Yeah. Well, politics was rough and tumble, and it's very important, and I'm glad you asked the question, because I would mislead if I'm sort of saying this idyllic, angelic Lincoln. I think the movie Lincoln maybe overdoes it a bit with dealing with all these guys that are doing this sort of stuff. But Lincoln, we've come to learn, was a real person who knew how to work the party machine. For example, he understood that one of the best constituencies was the German immigrants. And we now know that he actually bought a German newspaper anonymously because he recognized that the Germans who had come from Europe were strongly anti-slavery, strongly Republican. So he knew how to work that machine. And he did not become, he wasn't a novice elected president. He was 4 times in the Illinois state legislature. He'd run for the Senate twice. He'd been a congressman once. So he was a guy that really was very clear about it. And it was rough and tumble. It never stopped. And whether it was more or less, that could be debated, but it was difficult at that time, yeah.
Oh. Could you address the struggle and how it was often held against him, and there were a lot of vicious rumors about his Grant's alcoholism and how he was able to, on his own, eventually conquer that?
Thank you. This is a very debated topic. Someone called me last week who wants to write an article where he's going to take 2 of us that are on one side and 2 of us that are on the other side. My feeling is that Grant struggled with alcohol. I'm not able to call him an alcoholic. He struggled with alcohol especially when he was away from Julia. They had a phenomenal marriage. And when he was posted out to the Pacific coast, to Oregon, and then to California, and he was away from her and their children, who he'd never seen, he probably did get into drinking. That's very difficult to determine, and he may have had a conflict with the person in charge there. And in the midst of all that, he resigned. And yet I've found many other examples where people who were with Grant at different banquets or dinners would say they offered wine or whatever, and Grant did not drink that wine. So, and a lot of scurrilous terrors. So that in the Battle of Shiloh, he's staying in the home of a woman who is a Confederate sympathizer. He hears the guns of Shiloh at 6 o'clock in the morning. He immediately gets up from breakfast and charges forth. The story was Grant was drinking at breakfast before Shiloh, and the woman said, "That is absolutely ridiculous. You know, he was in my home. He was not doing that." So it's a very contested story. I think as he progressed and aged and matured, this became much less of an issue for him. Yeah.
Since we're in the Library of Congress, where language is everything, you mentioned that, this sort of relates to the first question too, you mentioned that Petraeus thought Grant the greatest general.
Yes.
People in literature regard his autobiography, the greatest biography, the greatest writing of a president.
Yes.
Probably next to Lincoln's.
Mm-hmm.
Would you comment on the writing styles, and is there a correlation, do you think, between, as I think most people here would, that there's a correlation between the quality of thought and action and the quality of being able to write cogent, logical, and beautiful sentences?
Wonderful comment and question. I don't believe that Grant fully understood how good a writer he was. What happened was at the end of towards the end of his life, there were no presidential pensions. So he one day at his Long Branch, New Jersey summer home bit into a peach and felt this incredible pain. 3 months later, seeing a doctor, a biopsy, cancer. He understood that this was terminal cancer. He was very much against writing his memoirs. He thought that memoirs were self-serving, egotistical, and settling scores. Do you realize that during the 8 years of Dwight Eisenhower, only one memoir was ever written by a member of his cabinet? Would you like to count how many were written during George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and already Donald Trump? But now he had to provide for Julia. So the Century magazine offered him $10,000 to write his memoir, which was a considerable sum in those days. Mark Twain heard about it. Mark Twain said of himself, "I am Grant intoxicated." I love the man. He charged over to Grant's home at East 62nd Street and said, "What did they offer you?" That's what they'd offer an unknown Comanche to write his memoirs. "I'll offer you to publish it with my son-in-law and our new publishing company, and I'll give you 70% of the proceeds." They were going to give him 10% royalty. So Grant's prose is direct, simple, straightforward. He's very generous to both friend and foe. He was an editor of his own work even as he's dying of cancer. And so it is, as you suggest, it is a kind of a model. What I want to tell you is that in the last 2 years, 2 wonderful annotated versions of the memoirs have been published. And the beauty of the annotation is, you know, you and I might read it and say, well, what is this? Who is this? The annotations are marvelous because they fill in the story of who are these people? What is he really talking about here? I've had so many people across this nation tell me that in reading Grant's memoirs, this was really a treasure experience for them. So I commend it to you. It doesn't go into the presidency. He stops at the end of the Civil War, but he does talk about a lot of his young life. It's really worth reading. Thank you.
You mentioned the string of generals that proved to be disappointments for Lincoln, and one name that stands out is George McClellan, who Lincoln seemed to be giving chance after chance despite a lot of opposition to Lincoln from McClellan. Can you talk about that, and especially why did Lincoln keep giving them opportunities?
Slow down just a little bit and say that again. I didn't get all of it.
What I wanted to know is why did Lincoln keep giving someone like George McClellan multiple opportunities
Gotcha. Yeah,
to lead his army?
Yeah. Well, George McClellan was the so-called young Napoleon of his age. When he received command from Lincoln, he was 34 years old, and he wrote to his wife sort of saying, well, they recognize who I am, and I'm going to be the savior of this country. But Lincoln was caught in a bind because as much as we might look back and see that of McClellan's faults, he was never quite ready. He always was drilling the troops. He overestimated the size of the opposition. McClellan was quite popular with his own troops. He was very popular with his own men. And so Lincoln understood that. So I think we could fault Lincoln for staying too long with McClellan, but why did he stay so long? Because he understood that McClellan was popular with the men underneath his command.
Over here.
You've spoken really well of both Lincoln and Grant. Do you think that there was a point during the war where they could have lost it? Or do you think that their combined abilities would have led them to win the war?
That's a great question. Is there a point when they could have lost it? You know, we look back again, we see the huge difference in the size of the armies, the industrial might. James McPherson, in his path-breaking book, The Battle Cry of Freedom, which I think is written in some senses also in the wake of the war in Vietnam, where we reckon, and he ends his book with kind of 9 different points of contingency. What if? And it's not inevitable that the North would have won that war. There were moments where perhaps the war could have been lost. The South did have some tremendous generals, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and people like that. So we have to be very careful in looking back and saying, well, of course this was inevitable, it was always going to happen. I mean, this war went on for more than 4 years. We used to think there were 620,000 dead, and a demographer about 8 or 10 years ago, comparing the 1860 census to the 1870 census, has now revised our estimate. There were 750,000 dead in a nation of barely more than 30 million people, more casualties than all of our other wars put together. So yes, the war might have been lost. I mean, Grant thought that by the summer of 1862 was the lowest point of the war, and he was discouraged by what was taking place, as was Lincoln. And so Lincoln, you may know this, wrote a note to his cabinet where he had received a word from the Republican National Committee meeting in New York that you will lose the 1864 election. You will be defeated in New York. You will even be defeated in Illinois. And he brings this note to his cabinet saying, when we are defeated in the next election, it will be our duty to cooperate with the new administration. Well, then just several weeks later, Sherman captures Atlanta, and everything begins to change.
There's a question back there.
I read Grant's autobiography, and just two comments. I hope the new editions replace the original maps. They may have been state-of-the-art at the time, but I don't think if you weren't familiar, and I was, but if you weren't familiar with the locations, the movements of the troops, those maps don't help you a whole lot. I understand they had the restrictions.
Yeah.
The other thing struck me, though, he'd go on and on and on talking about this general, how he screwed up here and he should have done this and whatever. And then he'd always finish up, or frequently finish up, but I may be wrong, I may not know all the facts. Is that an observation that only I've made? Am I reading that wrong?
Wonderful. What you just said is so important to hear. Here, Grant is struggling to finish these memoirs. He will finish it 3 days before he dies. And at the very end, he's willing to say, I may be wrong. I may not have all the facts. What kind of an attitude, what kind of a person is that? Instead of saying, I was right and they were wrong. This is the way memoirs were written. And this is the way Sherman wrote his memoirs. Grant didn't like Sherman's memoirs. I was right and they were wrong. This is so different than the memoirs that were written in that time. Yeah, so different. Yeah.
There's a question right here.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious about the role of West Point in both Grant's life and in the Civil War. I was looking at some information, and I saw just how many Civil War generals on both sides went to West Point.
Yes.
Stonewall Jackson did, Robert E. Lee did, even I think Pickett did. They all seem to go through West Point. Could you just talk about how that impacted the war, and then also what Grant learned there that would serve him later on?
Well, when West Point was established, it was very, very controversial. People were worried about a standing army. They had seen what a standing army had done in the French Revolution. Thomas Jefferson was originally against West Point. He changed his mind when he became president. West Point had a low esteem in the minds of the people of this country. It all began to change with the war with Mexico, and then people saw what an army could do. The surprising thing to me was that there were very, very few, almost no military courses. The idea was that if you learned basic logic and reason and engineering and science, you would somehow be able to figure out what to do. Well, the battlefields in the American Civil War were so much larger than the battlefields in any battle heretofore fought in Europe. So one of the beauties of Grant, that he was a painter at West Point. He was quite an artist, and he had the imagination to figure out what to do in this battlefield. West Point was a place where he did know some of these people, and he had taken their measure at West Point, and then he took it again on the battlefield. Because you're standing at, I said in my biography, your standing at West Point was revised according to what you did in the war with Mexico. Now we're going to see how the theory translates into action. And those who were often at the top of the class were at the bottom of the class. Longstreet was second from the bottom of his class. He deserved to be near the top of his class in terms of the way they performed. So I tried to understand what West Point meant to these people. It gave them an esprit de corps, not simply and a discipline, not simply the classes that they took.
In Charles Frazier's book, Verena, he writes about the relationship between Julia Grant and Verena Davis after the Civil War.
Yes.
And one, is it true? And two, is this a reflection of that reconciliation that you spoke about earlier?
Thank you. That's a great question. I was really struck, I didn't know this when I started, that here Grant and Jefferson Davis never met. There's so many ironies in writing history. Grant is going to resign out in California, so he writes his letter to the Secretary of War, who is Jefferson Davis, just as Jefferson Davis is writing a letter to Grant saying, you've now been promoted to captain. So they never met. Julia and Grant had this amazing relationship, one of the great marriages in American history. Grant dies, Jefferson Davis dies. Julia is vacationing in the Hudson Valley, which is one of the great places to vacation. She understands that Verena Davis is in the same hotel. She goes over and knocks on the door and introduces herself. And then, this is true. And then people watch the two of them drive together in a carriage down Fifth Avenue, and they become good friends. So in a certain way, these two women enact this kind of reconciliation, you use the word, that hopefully was what could happen after the war. It's quite a compelling story.
One big what-if scenario is what if Grant actually had quit again, as he had determined to do, chafing under the leadership of General Halleck at the time, who by all accounts was quite jealous of Grant, and thankfully Sherman talked him out of it.
Yes.
Can you please talk about how that affected Grant and what he learned from it that served him well in leadership going forward, as he was able to utilize Halleck quite effectively once he was his boss as opposed to...
Very perceptive comment and question. What the gentleman is referring to is that Grant, we have to say, was surprised at Shiloh. There's no way of getting around it. But after the first night, he can't stand to be inside the hospital where all these amputations are going on. So he stands underneath a tree under pouring rain. And Sherman comes up to him and says, boy, we got our tails whipped today. And Grant says, we're going to whip them tomorrow. And they do. But Halleck then says, I'll take the field and you'll become second in command. Halleck is the sort of general-in-chief in Washington. Well, this is really grates on Grant. And so at one point, Grant has had enough. He's going to resign from the military. Sherman hears about this. Early in the war, Sherman was in trouble. He was even accused of insanity. So Sherman rushes over to Grant and says, you came to my stead when I was in trouble, and I'm now coming to you. You are not going to resign. Your day will come. So then during the Civil War, as Grant assumes command, he makes Halleck his chief of staff. However, he learns years later that Halleck had been in correspondence with McClellan of how to get Grant. So in the memoirs, there's an absence. Halleck doesn't appear in the memoirs. He doesn't criticize Halleck. He just kind of is absent from the memoirs.
I think there's a question all the way in the back.
Lincoln's rhetoric frequently spoke to people's faith convictions in the country. Did Grant, who respected Lincoln, disregard the essence of that communication? Or what was his attitude toward the faith convictions of the country and the healing after the war?
Wonderful question. One of my convictions is that the whole faith dimension, to use your term, has been lacking as we write our American biographies. Whether we think, well, that was 19th century, people believed back there, we don't do that now. No, this is very important. I think the story of the progression of Lincoln's faith is a remarkable story. It's a Presbyterian story. For Grant, it's a Methodist story. He's not nearly as eloquent as Lincoln. He doesn't speak about it, but I think Grant's Methodist ethic is very important, and he got that ethic more from his mother than his father. This is where he got his self-effacement, or what we would call humility. I initially wrote my biography too long, and my editor told me to drop 150 pages. Oh my goodness. So I took out a story, which I wish I would have been kept in. At the beginning of the second term, Grant writes to all the members of his cabinet, and he said, I want us to meet on Sunday morning at the Methodist church I attend. The Methodists were the first to build a national church in Washington. He said, I want us to pray together, and I think you will like my minister. He's really a great preacher. So although Grant did not wear his faith on his sleeve, I think we often underestimate the role of religion by asking the wrong questions. How often did a person attend church? And I think that Grant's Methodist faith was extremely important to him. He wasn't always very vocal about it, but I think it was kind of a way that he lived his life.
Time for one more question right here? Okay. And then there'll be plenty of time in the reception for
Yes.
more.
Thank you. As somebody who's done a lot of looking into the Lincoln assassination to lecture on the medical parts, I do get asked that question about what if Grant would have been there. And in your research with Grant, and my response has been, well, unlike Lincoln, I think he would have had more security with him as the general-in-chief.
Sure.
Am I correct? Did Grant have more burly guys around him than the weak security that Lincoln had at Ford's Theater?
That's a good question. Would Grant have brought more security? Interestingly, there wasn't much security in these days. I mean, even as president, Grant would just go strolling out in Washington by himself, and people said, you got to be careful. Someone's going to, well, I can take them on if they come after me, you know. And so, of course, John Wilkes Booth was known at Ford's Theater, so there was not any surprise that this actor was there in Ford's Theater. Nobody thought anything of it. So I don't think that Grant would have brought any more security that evening than was present.
I was thinking more
people to apprehend Booth after. Oh, I see. Okay. I don't pretend to be an expert on apprehending Booth, that other people have done that, but I don't know what Grant might have done in that story. I don't really know that. Yeah.
After the program, Ron will be signing books that are for sale right next door, right adjacent to the room right here in 113. So please take advantage of that and hopefully have one of your books signed. And we will have a reception afterwards, and Ron has kindly agreed to join us. So if you have additional questions that you may want to ask him, we'll be available for conversation for some time after the program. But please join me in thanking Ronald White for such a lovely conversation.
Thank you.